March 25, 421 AD. The marsh islands of the Venetian lagoon. The morning fog clung low over the water, so thick it softened the horizon into a pale blur. The tide whispered against the wooden stilts of a tiny trading hut, and the distant cries of seabirds echoed across the marsh. Fishermen, their boots sinking into wet silt, hauled dripping nets onto the planks while a faint, salty wind carried the smell of brine and damp reed. At this fragile outpost, half village, half floating dream, two merchants argued over the price of cloth, their voices sharp but thin in the cold morning air. They had come here seeking safety, desperate to escape the chaos tearing apart the mainland. None of them knew the world was about to change forever. In this moment, Venice was not a city. It was a joke. A scattering of huts tied together by flimsy wooden walkways. A last refuge for people who had nowhere else to go. But beneath the calm lagoon, something much larger was beginning to stir. For decades, waves of invaders, Visigoths, Lombards, wandering warbands, swept violently across northern Italy. Towns burned. Families fled. Land that had been stable for centuries suddenly turned hostile. And in the face of this collapse, people sought safety where no army could march. In the water, refugees crowded onto the tiny islands of the lagoon, pushing deeper into the mud and reeds. They built homes on stilts hammered into the shallow seabed. They wove reed mats into pathways. They learned how to survive in a landscape that swallowed anything too heavy. To outsiders, it was absurd. A city in the water? They scoffed. They'll drown by winter. But the people who settled there understood something others didn't. The swamp protected them. No cavalry could charge through a lagoon. No siege engines could be dragged across shifting mud. No army commander could predict the tides. This accidental sanctuary would soon become a fortress, but only if its people could endure the isolation and hunger that haunted these early years. Because something darker was stirring beyond the horizon. By the mid-6th century, as the Eastern Roman Empire struggled to reclaim Italy under the general Belisarius, the lagoon population grew explosively. Every fresh wave of violence on the mainland sent more families scrambling onto boats, crossing the choppy water in desperation. Children clung to whatever possessions they could carry: a cooking pot, a handful of grain, a crucifix. On foggy mornings, new rafts drifted in from the direction of the shattered cities of Padua and Aquileia. The lagoon dwellers watched silently as survivors climbed ashore, mud-streaked, shaking, traumatized, yet alive. And each time the community grew, they expanded deeper into the marsh, driving more wooden piles into the seabed. What no one realized yet was that this forced migration was forging something new, a population hardened by survival, bonded by necessity, and learning to live in a world the rest of Italy could not touch. And this cooperation, simple, desperate, improvised, would later become Venice's most powerful weapon. Yet for now, life was brutal. Food was scarce. Storm tides swallowed homes. Summer mosquitoes tormented everyone. Winter winds sliced painfully across the exposed water. Some nights, whole sections of the settlement groaned and sagged as the tides shifted beneath them. But even in this misery, whispers of ambition began to spread. What if this swamp refuge could be more? Around 639 AD, the lagoon communities took a step no one expected. They elected their first duke, a doge, chosen to unify their scattered islands. It was a fragile experiment, part tradition from the fading Roman world, part innovation born of their watery isolation. And outsiders laughed harder than ever. A doge? What nonsense, mainland nobles sneered. A ruler of mud and fish. But to the lagoon settlers, this moment was electric. It meant order. It meant identity. It meant they could face the mainland not as refugees but as a people. Still, storms were gathering. The Lombards tightened their grip on northern Italy. Trade routes collapsed. Even the Byzantine Empire, claiming authority over the lagoon, struggled to maintain control. Venice was caught between powerful forces, each demanding loyalty. One wrong step could have wiped the settlement from history forever. But the lagoon people made a choice that would echo across centuries. They refused to be controlled. They balanced loyalties, played rivals against one another, and slowly carved out a political space no empire could easily touch. Their watery landscape kept them safe, and their cunning kept them independent. Little did they know, this decision would one day allow them to dominate the Mediterranean. But for now, the people of the lagoon were simply clinging to survival, unaware that their fragile wooden platforms would soon rise into the wealthiest city on earth. Something vast was coming, something that would reshape their fate entirely. A storm of opportunity was forming beyond the Adriatic. Autumn, 810 AD. Rialto, heart of the Venetian lagoon. The smell of salted fish mingled with the smoke of cooking fires as merchants and craftsmen bustled along the narrow wooden walkways that stitched together Rialto. Boats creaked in the rippling water, sails snapping in the brisk breeze, as families unloaded barrels of grain, hides, and precious textiles. Children darted between legs, clutching handfuls of bread, their laughter carrying faintly over the squawk of gulls. The air was sharp with the scent of the sea, but tinged with something else, ambition. No one could yet see that this collection of stilts and huts was slowly becoming a hub that would dominate trade across the Mediterranean. But something indefinable hummed beneath the surface, a nervous energy that something extraordinary was forming. The Doge, cloaked in a simple wool tunic, surveyed the growing settlement from a high wooden platform. He watched the merchants argue over prices, the sailors haul cargo, the carpenters hammering at new docks. Every movement was a calculated risk. The lagoon was both protector and threat. A misstep, too much weight on a pier, a poorly tied mooring, could send fortunes sinking into the murky waters below. They were learning to bend the lagoon to their will. By the 9th century, Venice's position on the Adriatic coast had begun to draw attention from far beyond the marshes. The Byzantine Empire, still influential in the eastern Mediterranean, recognized the lagoon's strategic value. They granted Venice trade privileges and tax exemptions, little realizing that these small concessions were planting seeds of autonomy. Venetian ships began to slip beyond the lagoon, touching ports along the Dalmatian coast, the Ionian Islands, and eventually, the Levant. The people of Venice, once refugees fleeing Lombard swords, were now navigators, merchants, and shipbuilders. Wooden stilts became stone foundations, reed huts became warehouses, and simple fishing skiffs transformed into sleek, flat-bottomed vessels capable of crossing open seas. By now, Venice was no longer a joke. It was a rising power that even emperors began to notice with cautious respect. And yet, every advance carried danger. Pirates lurked in the Adriatic, storms threatened cargo, and political alliances could shift overnight. Venice learned to survive by being cunning, flexible, and utterly relentless. By 1000 AD, Venice had developed an intricate network of canals, bridges, and fortified structures. The Rialto market became the beating heart of Venetian commerce. Merchants traded with Egypt, the Byzantine Empire, and even as far as the Islamic caliphates. Silk, spices, grain, glass, goods once thought unattainable, slid silently along the canals into Venetian warehouses. The Doge's council worked tirelessly to codify laws that regulated trade, set taxes, and protected the city from internal strife. The streets, lined with warehouses and workshops, vibrated with life. Workers carried bolts of fabric, barrels of oil, amphorae of wine. Horses were rare, carts were limited. So people adapted. The canals became roads, gondolas became taxis, and every citizen was connected to the pulse of trade. But the city was not invincible. Every triumph invited envy. Rival Italian cities, Padua, Verona, and later Florence, watched with suspicion and disdain. Maritime rivals from Amalfi to Genoa bristled at Venice's growing influence. Venice had to learn the art of diplomacy, bluffing, and subtle threats long before the first cannon ever fired in Europe. And in the shadows of Rialto's bustling markets, whispers of larger ambitions began to take root. Some merchants dreamed of monopolies, others of fleets that could cross the entire Mediterranean without fear. And the Doge, ever watchful, knew that the lagoon's safety would not last forever. To protect wealth, Venice needed more than stilts and ingenuity. It needed power that could rival kings and emperors. They had no idea what was waiting just beyond the horizon. By the late 11th century, Venice's transformation was undeniable. Its ships dominated trade routes, its artisans produced goods coveted across Europe, and its political structure, unique, adaptable, fiercely independent, provided stability that many mainland rulers could only envy. Venice had become more than a refuge. It was a beacon of ingenuity, commerce, and ambition. Yet the city's rise carried subtle tension. Success attracted enemies, both human and natural. The lagoon that had protected them for centuries could turn deadly in a storm. Trade wars, pirate raids, and the volatile politics of the Byzantine Empire threatened every ship, every merchant, every home. Venice's prosperity hung by a fragile thread, and the first hints of the coming struggle were beginning to appear. What came next would test not just Venice's wealth, but the very soul of its people. Spring 1204 AD. Venice as the Fourth Crusade looms. The Adriatic gleamed under the early morning sun, each ripple of water sparkling like 1,000 tiny jewels. Sailors shouted commands over the slap of oars and the creak of timber, as gondolas and galleys glided past the growing stone palaces that now lined the canals. The air carried the scent of salt, pitch, and incense from nearby chapels, mingling with the metallic tang of weapons being readied. Merchants jostled in narrow streets, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony that somehow harmonized with the city's pulse. Venice was no longer a simple refuge. It was a city poised to dominate not just trade, but history itself. In the Doge's palace, gilded walls reflected flickering torchlight as ambassadors from Byzantium, the Holy Roman Empire, and Genoa convened. The Doge leaned over maps, tracing trade routes with a finger calloused from years of rowing and negotiation. His eyes glinted with calculation. He knew Venice's wealth made it a target, but it also offered leverage. In a world of kings and crusaders, power was often measured in coin and cunning rather than armies. Yet tension was thick. Rumors whispered in shadowed corridors of a crusade bound for Constantinople. Venice's merchants saw opportunity, but many feared the consequences. To manipulate an empire was one thing, to attack it was another. By 1202, the Fourth Crusade set its eyes on the Byzantine Empire. Venice offered its fleet, negotiating a price that most would have considered exorbitant. Yet the city's leaders had already calculated. Supplying the Crusaders meant immense profit and unprecedented influence. Thousands of tons of supplies, grain, weapons, horses, were loaded onto Venetian ships. Dockworkers labored day and night, sweat and salt water mixing on their faces, muscles straining against ropes and planks. The lagoon vibrated with anticipation. Merchants counted coins, captains checked sails, and families clung to hope that this venture would enrich them beyond imagination. But the Doge knew, more than anyone, that Venice's real prize would not come from trade alone. It would come from seizing opportunity at precisely the right moment, where others hesitated. A subtle tension filled the city. The streets, alive with commerce, carried whispers of destiny. Some celebrated, some feared. And always, the water beneath the city reminded them of fragility. The same tides that protected could also betray. When the Crusaders finally reached Constantinople, Venice executed its plan with calculated precision. Venetian ships blocked exits. Merchants and soldiers coordinated their moves with a synchrony that seemed almost choreographed. The city's strategic brilliance became evident. Every decision was a thread in a tapestry that would shift the balance of power in the Mediterranean. The capture of Constantinople was catastrophic for Byzantium but transformative for Venice. Art, wealth, and influence flowed back to the lagoon city. Palaces were rebuilt with marble and mosaics, workshops buzzed with artisans producing luxury goods, and the Doge's council grew in authority and sophistication. Yet every triumph carried shadows. Rival Italian cities seethed, jealous of Venice's sudden dominance. Byzantine loyalists whispered revenge. Even within the city, factions argued over the ethical cost of their gain. Venice had become rich, powerful, and feared, but the very same forces that elevated it could also undo it. By the mid-13th century, Venice's trade empire stretched across the Mediterranean, Egypt, Syria, the Levant, and beyond. Spices, silks, precious metals, goods once thought exotic flowed into Venetian markets. Ships bristling with cargo departed daily, captained by men who had grown up rowing in shallow lagoon channels but now commanded vessels rivaling those of kings. The city itself had transformed. Stone buildings rose where reeds once grew. Bridges spanned canals with grace and engineering brilliance. Statues, chapels, and markets reflected wealth beyond imagination. But amidst the splendor, the city's leaders remained vigilant. Each success attracted enemies: pirates, rival states, even internal conspiracies. Venice had mastered survival, commerce, and diplomacy, but every day posed a choice: to defend, to expand, or to gamble everything. They had built a city on water, but now they were building a legacy on ambition. And just beyond the horizon, new challenges loomed, forces that would test not just Venice's wealth, but its very identity. The next storm would be unlike any they had faced before. Winter, 1379 AD. The Arsenal of Venice. A bitter wind whipped across the Venetian arsenal, carrying the scent of sawdust, pitch, and salt water. Hundreds of workers labored amid the deafening rhythm of hammers on timber, the groan of cranes lifting enormous masts, and the hiss of molten metal as cannonballs were cast. Smoke spiraled from forges where iron fittings were shaped for the largest fleet the Mediterranean had ever seen. The Doge, cloaked in fur-lined robes, paced a raised platform, eyes sharp, breath misting in the icy air. No one in the city doubted it. Venice was at the peak of its power. And yet, an unspoken tension threaded through the crowd of builders, sailors, and merchants alike. They were crafting more than ships, they were forging the tools of empire. Ships, long the lifeblood of Venice, had evolved. Sleek galleys bristling with crossbows and cannons could carry both goods and soldiers across thousands of miles of sea. Venetian merchants were no longer mere traders, they were warriors of commerce, and their wealth was the sharpest weapon of all. The city had faced sieges, storms, and rival fleets for centuries. Now, every victory and every conquest was a step toward uncontested maritime supremacy. Venice controlled trade routes from the Black Sea to Alexandria, commanding spices, silks, grains, and gold. Its diplomats negotiated treaties that left even kings uneasy, while Venetian merchants amassed fortunes that would dwarf entire European principalities. But dominance bred danger. Genoa, Amalfi, and later the Ottoman threat hovered like predators, waiting for a misstep. Venice's fleet was its shield and sword, yet every victory invited scrutiny. Each canal, each bridge, each warehouse brimming with exotic goods was a symbol of both triumph and vulnerability. Inside the arsenal, a master shipwright paused, wiping sweat from his brow, staring at a massive galley taking shape. Its hull gleamed like darkened gold. "This," he murmured, "will carry Venice across the world." The Doge nodded, knowing the risk. "And it will protect her if we command it wisely." By the late 14th century, Venice's political ingenuity rivaled its maritime skill. The city-state perfected a delicate balance. The Doge held supreme authority, yet councils of merchants and nobles influenced every decision, ensuring that ambition never unraveled unity. Venice's courts enforced trade laws, regulated markets, and maintained security, allowing commerce to flourish while minimizing internal unrest. The climax of Venice's rise, however, came not from governance alone, but from the boldest ventures of its fleet. In the early 15th century, Venetian ships braved the Aegean, the Levant, and beyond, establishing colonies, trade posts, and exclusive trading privileges. Every expedition carried risk. Storms could scatter ships, pirates could steal cargo, and political alliances could collapse. But every reward was immense: goods that could fill entire city blocks, coins that could fund fortresses, and influence that could sway kings. Yet even at the pinnacle, Venice's leaders knew the precarious truth. The empire they built on water, trade, and ingenuity could be undone by a single miscalculation. A storm could sink a fleet, a betrayal could topple a treaty, a disease could decimate the population. Their triumph was magnificent, but fragile. On a moonlit night, the canals reflected lanterns like molten gold, the hum of activity ceasing only briefly for the hush of the tide. In palaces and workshops, People whispered stories of Venice's power, marveling at the fleets that could circle the Mediterranean in weeks. Yet, in the Doge's council chambers, the mood was sober. Each decision now carried weight beyond wealth, reputation, survival, legacy. It was in this delicate balance of ambition, ingenuity, and calculated risk that Venice achieved its apogee. The city had transformed from a laughingstock of refugees to the richest, most stable power in Europe. Every plank driven into the lagoon, every canal dug, every treaty signed had led to this moment. Venice at the height of its might, a city of gold and water, of commerce and cunning. But history, ever restless, would not pause. Even now, beyond the Adriatic horizon, forces stirred that would challenge Venice in ways no merchant, soldier, or doge could fully predict. The tide of fortune had reached its peak, but the next wave promised upheaval, threats that would test not just the city's wealth, but its very identity. Summer, 1489 AD. Venice, the Lido Channel. The sun reflected off the turquoise Adriatic, illuminating fleets of galleys lined like soldiers awaiting inspection. Seagulls wheeled above, their cries mingling with the clatter of rigging and the rhythmic splash of oars. Dockworkers hauled crates filled with spices from Alexandria, silk from Constantinople, and exotic timber from Dalmatia. Lanterns hung along the wooden piers, catching the glint of coin being counted by eager merchants. Venice had become a city the world both admired and feared. Its wealth was unparalleled, its political structure admired across Europe, and its maritime dominance virtually uncontested. Yet with greatness came consequences, complex, subtle, and often dangerous. The city's wealth made it a target. Rival states, once mocked by the city of mud and fish, now viewed Venice with envy and hostility. Genoa remained the fiercest competitor, challenging Venetian control of trade routes across the Mediterranean. Pirates and corsairs lurked along the Aegean and Levantine coasts, ready to strike at any overconfident merchant ship. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were expanding in the east, threatening to disrupt centuries of carefully cultivated alliances. Venice had learned to balance diplomacy with military strength, but every success carried the risk of overreach. Internally, Venice faced its own challenges. The merchant oligarchy, which had been instrumental in the city's rise, now jostled for influence. Factions within the councils debated the city's strategy: expand too fast, and resources might crumble, hesitate, and rivals would seize the advantage. The delicate equilibrium between doge, council, and populace required constant vigilance. Yet Venice endured. Its system of canals and fortified arsenals allowed the city to maintain resilience even when external threats loomed. Wealth was reinvested into infrastructure. Bridges were strengthened, warehouses expanded, and fleets continuously upgraded. Venetian artisans produced masterpieces of glass, lace, and painting, turning the city into a cultural as well as economic capital. Palaces rose, mosaics gleamed in churches, and the city's skyline became iconic across Europe. The consequences of Venice's earlier decisions, settling in a swamp, mastering commerce, and asserting political autonomy, were now fully visible. The city that had once been laughed at had become an engine of wealth, influence, and ingenuity. Trade routes crisscrossed the Mediterranean, connecting Venice to Africa, the Middle East, and Northern Europe. Its ships were the envy of empires, its markets a nexus of exotic goods and opportunity. Yet beneath this glittering success lay fragility. The city depended on imported grain to feed its population. Disease spread easily along canals crowded with ships. Storms and floods threatened homes built atop wooden stilts. Venice's reliance on maritime supremacy meant that a single naval defeat could unravel decades of prosperity. The city's leaders knew that to survive, they must remain vigilant, flexible, and cunning. By the late 16th century, Venice's political and economic structure had been solidified. Its oligarchic republic, balanced between doge, councils, and guilds, created stability few European states could match. Its maritime empire, though contested, ensured wealth flowed steadily into the city. The consequences of centuries of daring decisions were clear. Venice had not only survived, it had thrived in a world that had once written it off. But survival was not the end of the story. The seeds of legacy, the lessons of innovation, adaptation, and calculated risk were already preparing Venice for centuries of influence, shaping a city whose mark on history would endure far beyond the lagoon. The tides of fortune had ebbed and flowed, but Venice had learned to navigate every wave. And yet, even as the city basked in triumph, whispers of future trials drifted through the canals, hinting that even the richest city on earth was not immune to change. Autumn, 1610 AD. Piazza San Marco, Venice. The morning light shimmered across the golden mosaics of St. Mark's Basilica, reflecting onto the polished marble of the piazza. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the briny tang of the lagoon, while the calls of merchants hawking spices and silks resonated across the bustling square. Gondoliers guided sleek boats through shimmering canals, their oars slicing the water with rhythmic precision. Tourists, diplomats, and traders alike marveled at the city's grandeur, unaware of the centuries of struggle and ingenuity that had shaped it. Venice had become more than a city. It was a symbol, a testament to resilience, ambition, and vision. From swampy refuge to the wealthiest maritime republic in Europe, it had defied expectations at every turn. The legacy of Venice was written not only in its grand palaces, bustling markets, and legendary fleets, but in its approach to governance and commerce. The city perfected a balance between political stability and economic freedom, creating a republic that encouraged innovation while controlling internal discord. Its canals, both lifeblood and streets, became symbols of adaptability, allowing a city built on water to thrive where others would have drowned. Venice's merchants and artisans became legends in their own right, spreading glassmaking, lacework, and navigational knowledge across Europe and beyond. The city's fleets, once simple fishing vessels, had grown into instruments of diplomacy and power, shaping the Mediterranean political landscape. Yet the true genius of Venice lay in its people. Generations of citizens had transformed adversity into opportunity. They had taken a swamp, the world's mockery, and with ingenuity, courage, and relentless determination, turned it into a seat of wealth, culture, and influence. Each bridge, each dock, each merchant ship was a testament to that enduring spirit. By the 17th century, Venice's influence extended far beyond the lagoon. Its trade networks spanned continents, its diplomacy shaped empires, and its art and architecture inspired generations. Yet the city remained vigilant, aware that power, like the tides, was never permanent. Political rivals, economic shifts, and natural forces would eventually challenge its supremacy, but Venice had already proven it could survive the impossible. As you stand in the piazza today, imagining the clatter of hooves long gone, the cries of merchants, and the gentle lapping of the lagoon against wooden pilings, it's impossible not to feel the weight of history. Venice is not merely a city frozen in time. It is a living narrative, a story of human resilience, ingenuity, and the relentless pursuit of prosperity. What began as a refuge for the desperate became a city that shaped the course of the Mediterranean, a city that turned ridicule into respect, isolation into influence, and ambition into empire. And in the quiet moments, when the canals glimmer under the moonlight, one can still sense the echoes of those early settlers, watching, building, and daring to dream that a swamp could become the richest city on earth. Venice stands as a reminder that even the most improbable beginnings can lead to extraordinary destinies.